Three Nights in Camelot. Chapter 1. The summons. The sacred pool in Avalon's heart turned black at moonrise, and Morgana knew before the Lady of the Lake emerged that the news would shatter what remained of the old world. She knelt on moss-covered stones, her priestess robes heavy with evening mist, watching ripples spread across water that had been still for 100 years. The lady rose without breaking the surface, her silver hair, then her ageless face, finally her arm extending a rolled parchment, sealed with Arthur's stag and oak. Morgana didn't need to break the wax to know what it contained. She'd seen this moment in her dreams for months. Her brother's signature on a death warrant for the goddess. The letter was brief, written in Arthur's own hand rather than a scribe's careful script, which somehow made it worse. He would issue an edict in 4 days' time. All practice of the old religion would be forbidden throughout Britain. Temples would be dismantled, priestesses exiled, the sacred groves cut down and burned. It was Guinevere's bishops who had pushed for this. Morgana could smell their righteousness in every word, but Arthur's hand had held the pen. The Lady of the Lake spoke only once before sinking back into darkness. 3 nights. After that, the mists close forever, and Avalon sleeps until Britain remembers how to dream. Morgana crushed the parchment in her fist, watching ink bleed across her palm like prophecy. She had until dawn on the 4th day to save everything she'd ever loved, using the very magic her brother feared most. The irony tasted like ashes. Chapter 2. The Christian court. Camelot had become a stranger wearing her childhood home's face. Morgana rode through gates she'd run through as a girl, but crosses now crowned every tower where once oak and mistletoe had grown. The great hall's old tapestries woven with spirals and stags and the goddess's triple moon had been replaced with scenes of saints and martyrs, their flat gold halos watching her with painted disapproval. Even the air smelled different. No more wood smoke and herbs, but incense and beeswax and the particular staleness of men who believed suffering brought them closer to God. She counted 12 priests in the courtyard alone, their tonsured heads gleaming like blisters in the afternoon sun. Arthur received her in the throne room with all the warmth of a judge greeting a criminal. He'd grown older, harder, the easy smile of their youth buried under crown and responsibility. A servant showed her 2 chambers in the western tower, the oldest and coldest part of the castle, where honored guests were never housed. The rooms hadn't been aired in months. Dust covered the furniture like snow, and someone had painted a cross above the door protection against whatever unholy thing now slept within. From her window, Morgana could see the entire castle, the training yards where knights practiced with blunted swords, the chapel where bells rang every 3 hours, the kitchens where servants still made the sign against evil when they thought no one watched, and beyond the walls, the forest where she and Arthur had played as children, hunting for fairy rings and building forts from fallen branches. The trees were thinner now, cut back to make room for fields and sheep. She'd painted her face with woden patterns her mother once wore, marking her as Avalon's daughter before she was Camelot's blood. Arthur's jaw tightened, but he gestured her to the high table, seating her between Guinevere and a bishop who radiated disapproval like heat from a forge. The meal was elaborate. Swan and venison, peacock redressed in its own feathers, wine from Gaul that cost more than a peasant earned in years. Morgana ate nothing, waiting for the moment between courses when attention wandered and wine loosened the court's careful control. She began the glamour as servants cleared the swan, whispering words older than Latin into her cup before drinking. The magic tasted like spring water and moonlight, sliding down her throat and spreading through her blood like welcome fever. Morgana let it build, feeding it with memory and hope and desperate love for what was dying. Then she released it with a breath, and the hall transformed. The transformation was subtle at first. The torches seemed to burn brighter, the music sweeter, the very air shimmering with possibility. Then the walls began to change, stone sprouting vines heavy with white flowers, the Christian tapestries fading to reveal older patterns beneath. A priestess appeared beside each bishop, not threatening but companionable, sharing wine and conversation. The knights' swords sprouted oak leaves from their pommels. The cross above Arthur's throne twisted gently into a Celtic knot, embracing rather than replacing. Arthur stood slowly, his face full of wonder, and Morgana's heart leapt. Perhaps it would be this easy. Perhaps one taste of what they'd lost would be enough. The king walked through his transformed hall as if dreaming, touching ivy that wasn't there, smiling at priestesses who existed only in Morgana's magic. "This," he whispered, and she thought he might weep. "This is what we could have. Both ways, both faiths, everything in balance." The court watched their king commune with illusions, and Morgana saw the exact moment it went wrong. Sir Kay's hand moving to his sword, a bishop making the sign of the cross, Guinevere's face going pale with fear. They didn't see possibility, they saw their king bewitched, enslaved, stolen by pagan sorcery. Morgana tried to gentle the glamour, to ease them into acceptance. But the magic had its own momentum now, growing wilder and stranger, until knights were seeing their dead companions, and ladies wept at visions of children never born. She broke the spell with a word, and the hall snapped back to torchlight and stone and cross, leaving everyone shaking and afraid. Arthur looked at her with something worse than anger, with betrayal, as if she'd confirmed every warning the bishops had whispered. The first night was done, and she had lost ground instead of gaining it. Chapter 4. The morning after dawn came cold and accusing through Morgana's tower window, bringing with it the sound of bells and angry voices. She hadn't slept, had spent the dark hours pacing her room and reviewing every moment of the failed glamour, searching for where she'd pushed too hard or not hard enough. The magic had been beautiful. She knew that, but beauty without consent was violation, and she'd violated an entire court's sense of safety. She'd meant to seduce them toward tolerance. Instead, she'd proven every fear about pagan witchcraft controlling Christian minds. A knock came at dawn, but not the servant with breakfast she expected. Instead, 3 bishops and Sir Bedivere, faces grim as executioners. They didn't arrest her, not quite. But Bedivere's hand stayed near his sword as the eldest bishop spoke. The court had spent the night in chapel, praying for deliverance from demonic influence. 6 knights claimed to have seen the devil in the transformed hall. A serving girl swore the wine had turned to blood in her cup. The bishops demanded Morgana's immediate banishment, calling last night's magic proof of the old religion's corruption, its willingness to enslave rather than enlighten. Bedivere, who'd fought beside her in the wars against the Saxons, couldn't meet her eyes. He'd been there last night. She remembered she'd seen him laughing at a vision of his young wife, dead these 10 years. Perhaps that was the cruelest part of glamour. It gave people what they wanted, then ripped it away, leaving them more bereft than before. Arthur summoned her to his private solar at midday, dismissing even Guinevere to speak with her alone. He looked exhausted, older than his years, ground down by the weight of crown and conscience. "What did you think would happen?" he asked, not shouting, but somehow worse, disappointed, weary, sad. "Did you think I would see that vision and simply forget everything else? The magic that killed our father, the enchantment that made our mother a tool, the spell that made me." Morgana opened her mouth to argue, to explain that not all magic was violation, that the old ways held beauty and healing too, but Arthur held up his hand. "I have given you 2 more nights because you are my sister and I loved you once. But if you use magic against my court again, I will have no choice but to act. The bishops want you burned. I am holding them back, barely." He turned to the window, dismissing her without another word, and Morgana walked back to her tower, knowing she had 2 nights left and no idea how to succeed where force had failed. Guinevere found her that evening, slipping into the tower room with a basket covered in cloth bread and cheese, wine and apples, because Morgana had eaten nothing since arriving. The queen was different in private, smaller, more vulnerable. The political mask set aside to reveal something almost like friendship. They'd never been close. Guinevere was everything Morgana was not. Devout and gentle and content with feminine spheres, but shared love of Arthur created a strange bond. "He is afraid," Guinevere said quietly, arranging the food with careful hands. "Not of you, exactly, but of what you represent. Choice taken away. Will subverted. He dreams sometimes of his conception, of Uther wearing Gorloï's face, of magic making his mother a wife to her husband's murderer. How can he trust any magic after that?" Morgana wanted to rage that healing magic and violation were different things. That Merlin's crime didn't condemn all the old ways, but Guinevere's eyes were kind and tired. And she realized the queen was offering help the only way she knew how, understanding. If Morgana wanted to change Arthur's mind, she couldn't bypass his fear. She had to face it, name it, somehow transform it. She had 2 nights left, and glamour had failed. Tomorrow, she would try prophecy, and pray to the goddess that truth worked where illusion had not. Chapter 5. The garden conversation. The castle gardens had once been Igraine's pride, full of healing herbs and roses, trained along stone walls, but Guinevere had transformed them into something halfway between beauty and penance. The herbs remained but now grew in the shapes of crosses and saints' symbols, and a statue of the Virgin Mary presided over the central fountain where, once a more ancient goddess, had poured water from her cupped hands. Morgana found the queen there in the pearl-gray light of early morning, kneeling in the dewy grass with dirt under her fingernails. tending lavender with the same devotion she brought to prayer. When Guinevere saw her, she didn't rise or curtsy, just gestured to the empty space beside her. And Morgana knelt in the wet earth, like a penitent or a fellow gardener, perhaps both. They worked in silence for a while, Guinevere showing her which plants needed deadheading, which craved more water, the quiet vocabulary of growing things that had nothing to do with magic or religion, but simply with care. Finally, the queen spoke without looking up. "The bishops believe you're here to curse Arthur. The knights think you'll try to kill him. Even Kay, who once called you friend, sleeps with his sword." Her hands moved gently through the lavender, releasing its scent into morning air. "But I think you're here to save something, and it's destroying you that you don't know how." Morgana's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. When had anyone last seen her clearly, without the veil of power or fear or old legend? Guinevere continued, her voice soft but relentless as growing roots. "Arthur fears magic because magic made him, and he's spent his whole life trying to prove he's more than Merlin's spell and Uther's lust. Every night he dreams of his mother's face when she discovered the deception, how the magic stole her choice, made her betray her husband's memory, made her conceive a child with her enemy. He wakes shaking, convinced he's the product of rape sanctified by sorcery. How can you ask him to trust the old ways when they violated the woman who gave him life?" The queen's hands stilled finally, resting in the herbs like a blessing or a surrender. "If you want to change his mind, you cannot avoid that wound. You must go into it. Show him that magic can be different, that power doesn't have to mean violation. But I don't know if he can hear that truth. The bishops have convinced him that all magic corrupts, that any power outside the church's control leads inevitably to darkness." Morgana sat back on her heels, really looking at Guinevere for perhaps the first time. This woman who'd chosen a gentler God but still understood sacrifice, who'd given up her own will to become Arthur's perfect Christian queen yet retained enough self to garden alone at dawn, who loved a knight she couldn't have and bore that impossible desire with grace instead of bitterness. "Why are you telling me this?" Morgana asked. "You're Christian now. You wear the cross. You've helped turn Camelot into what it is." Guinevere smiled, sad and knowing. "Because I chose my faith, Morgana. No one enchanted me into believing. No magic forced my conversion. Arthur deserves the same freedom to choose tolerance or prohibition, knowing the full truth, not manipulated by glamour or fear. And because..." She hesitated, pulling a weed with unnecessary force. "Because a kingdom with only one way of seeing is a kingdom going blind. I love my God, but I'm not fool enough to think he's diminished by the existence of your goddess." They parted with something like understanding, if not quite friendship, and Morgana returned to her tower with a new plan forming. She would show Arthur prophecy not threat, but true seeing, the future that awaited both paths. Let him see the cost of his edict, the slow starvation of the land when only half of Britain's sacred heritage remained. But she would also show him the fear was not unfounded, that magic could corrupt, that power needed wisdom. She would give him truth instead of illusion, reality instead of wish fulfillment. It would be harder magic, more dangerous prophecy always cut both ways, showing the caster's future as well as the subject's. But after last night's failure, she had no choice. Tomorrow night she would cast the scrying spell, and they would both see what waited in the years ahead. Chapter 6. Preparation for Prophecy. The magic Morgana needed couldn't be worked with herbs and whispered charms. Prophecy required blood and sacrifice, a tearing open of the veil between what is and what might be. She spent the day gathering materials, slipping through castle corridors like a ghost to avoid bishops and suspicious knights. From the kitchen she stole a black rooster, from the chapel a handful of frankincense, from the armory a knife that had tasted violence. In the forest beyond Camelot's walls, what little remained of it she found nightshade and white stones marked with natural holes, and a branch of hawthorn that had been struck by lightning. The ingredients would have made the bishops weep with vindication. Yes, this was dark magic, blood magic, the sorcery they feared most. But prophecy was not light or dark, it was simply true. In her tower room, she drew a circle on the floor with salt mixed with her own blood, pricked from her thumb at moonrise. The symbols she marked around its edge were older than Rome, older than the Druids, passed down from priestess to priestess in Avalon's most secret rites. Each mark was a gateway, a crack in time's wall through which future could bleed into present. The rooster she killed quickly, more prayer than violence, catching its blood in a silver bowl, and whispering gratitude for its sacrifice. Its death was not cruelty but exchange, a life given, so that future lives might be saved, might be seen and perhaps altered. She plucked 3 black feathers for the spell, then carried the bird's body to the window and released it to the ravens. Nothing was wasted in the old magic. Everything was honored. Everything was part of the whole. The actual spell would take hours to cast, and it would destroy her for days. After prophecy always took more than it gave, burning through the caster's strength like fever consuming the sick. Morgana had done this only twice before, and both times she'd lain unconscious for a week after, trapped in visions that wouldn't stop even when the spell was done. But she had no choice now, no safer option. Glamour had failed. Arguments would fail. Only truth remained, the terrible, beautiful truth of what would be if Arthur's edict stood. She began the chant at midnight, feeding the spell with blood and herbs and memory, with her own fear and hope and desperate love for a Britain that held room for both cross and crescent moon. The words were painful to speak, scraping her throat raw, and with each syllable, the future pressed closer, demanding to be born into sight. By the time the spell was ready, the circle complete, the ingredients combined, her own power stretched thin, as a blade's edge dawn was threatening the eastern sky. Morgana had one day to rest before night came again. Before Arthur would come to her tower drawn by magic or message or his own curiosity about what his mad sister might attempt next. She lay down within the circle, not daring to break it, and fell into shallow sleep full of fragmented visions. Arthur crowned and Arthur dying, Britain green and Britain barren, the goddess weeping and Christ triumphant, crosses and oak trees growing from the same soil or poisoning each other's roots. When she woke, Her nose was bleeding and her hands shook, but the spell held, patient and terrible, waiting for its final component, Arthur himself, stepping into the circle so prophecy could show him the cost of his choice. Chapter 7. Night 2. The vision of ruin. Arthur came to her tower at dusk, bringing no guards but carrying his sword, a compromise between trust and caution that would have made Morgana laugh if she weren't so exhausted from the spell's preparation. He looked around the room with barely concealed distaste, seeing the salt circle and the ritual implements, the symbols that confirmed every warning the bishops had given. "More magic," he said flatly. "I told you what would happen if you tried to bewitch my court again." But Morgana shook her head, gesturing to the circle. "Not bewitch show. This is prophecy, Arthur, true seeing, not illusion. I'll show you the future that awaits if you sign your edict, but it works both ways. I'll see what happens if you don't. We'll both see truth, whatever it costs us." She extended her hand. "Please. 3 hours. That's all I ask." He stood in her doorway for a long moment, torn between curiosity and caution, between the sister he'd loved as a boy and the sorceress the bishops called dangerous. Finally, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a sound like finality. He removed his crown, setting it aside, king becoming man, becoming brother. "If this is a trick," he said quietly, "if you try to control my mind again, I will have no choice but to let the bishops have their way. Do you understand?" Morgana nodded, too tired to argue, too desperate to resent his suspicion. She drew him into the circle, both of them kneeling on cold stone, marked with symbols of seeing, and began the final incantation. The words poured from her like water from a broken dam, and the air between them split open like overripe fruit. The vision took them both at once, dragging them out of the tower and into a future 5 years distant. They stood on a battlefield, not a glorious one from the old songs, but something muddy and small and sad, where Arthur's knights fought not Saxon invaders, but British rebels who still clung to the old ways. The king's edict had driven the believers underground, made them desperate and dangerous, turned faith into treason. Morgana watched Arthur's face as he saw himself ordered the execution of a priestess no older than 15. Her only crime teaching village children the names of healing herbs. The girl died badly, choking on the rope, and the crowd that watched was silent with horror and compliance. This was what Tolerance's death looked like. Not a single dramatic ending, but 1,000 small cruelties, each one justified by law and order and the greater good. The vision shifted, moving forward through time like a stone skipping across water. 10 years out, the sacred wells were drying up. Not because of drought, but because no one remembered the rituals that kept them flowing, the songs that called water from deep earth. 20 years, the forests were nearly gone, cut down without the druids' careful management, and the land was forgetting how to breathe. 30 years. Arthur lay dying on a battlefield exactly as the legends foretold. But there was no one to take him to Avalon, because Avalon had faded into complete myth. The mists closed forever. The priestesses scattered or dead or converted. He died alone, except for Bedivere, calling for Morgana with his last breath. But she was long dead too, executed as a traitor when she'd tried to keep teaching the old ways in secret. The vision showed her burning, showed her screaming not from pain but from the knowledge that everything she'd tried to save was ash. But the spell wasn't finished. It pivoted, showing the alternative future, the one where Arthur refused to sign the edict, and this path was no paradise either. The old religion survived, yes, but resentment festered in the Christian knights, who felt their king had betrayed heaven's mandate. Civil war came earlier in this timeline, brother against brother, faith against faith, until Britain tore itself apart in the name of competing civilizations. Arthur still died on a battlefield, still called for Morgana, still passed into legend, broken and alone. In this future too, she burned, but at pagan hands, accused of being too sympathetic to Christians, too willing to compromise, not pure enough in her devotion to the goddess. Both futures ended in ash and blood, and the slow death of everything beautiful. Both futures proved that there were no clean answers, no path that didn't cost everything. The vision released them simultaneously, dumping them back into Morgana's tower room like drowning swimmers gasping on a shore. Arthur scrambled away from the circle, his face white with shock, and Morgana curled on her side, tasting blood and defeat. She had shown him truth as promised, but the truth was that both choices led to ruin, that Britain was dying no matter what path he chose, that magic and faith and human nature were all tangled too tightly to ever separate cleanly. Arthur stood slowly, looking at her with something like pity. "You showed me nothing I didn't already fear," he said quietly. "The future is already broken, Morgana. We're just arguing about which way to fall." He left without another word, and the second night was done. Chapter 8. The interpretation morning came, with the sound of shouting in the courtyard, and Morgana dragged herself to the window to see Arthur surrounded by bishops and knights, all demanding to know what sorcery had transpired in the tower. Someone, probably a servant, had reported the king entering alone at dusk and emerging at midnight, pale and shaking like a man cursed. The bishops were spinning the narrative already, transforming prophecy into threat. The witch hadn't shown the king the future, but had cursed him with visions of doom, had threatened him with magical vengeance if he didn't obey her demands. Sir Kay stood with his hand on his sword, face hard with old loyalty twisted into new suspicion. Even Guinevere looked troubled, rosary clutched tight in her pale hands. Morgana couldn't hear Arthur's response from her tower, but she watched his face harden, watched him make the choice between defending his sister's magic and protecting his authority. He chose authority, he had to. She understood that. Tan gestured sharply toward her window. Within the hour, knights came to her door with orders from the king. She was confined to her tower until dawn of the fourth day. No more wandering the castle, no more access to the gardens or the hall or anywhere she might work her spells. A guard would stand at her door, and if she attempted any magic, she would be arrested immediately. It was protection as much as punishment. Arthur keeping the bishops from demanding something worse, but it felt like betrayal all the same. Bedivere delivered the order himself. This man who'd once called her friend, who'd fought beside her in the wars before Christianity swallowed Camelot whole. He wouldn't meet her eyes as he spoke the king's words, but when the other knights had gone, he lingered at the threshold. "What did you show him?" Bedivere asked quietly. "What did he see that made him look so broken?" Morgana considered lying, considered claiming she'd shown Arthur a glorious future where both faiths flourished, but she was so tired of lies and illusions and anything that wasn't simply terribly true. "I showed him that we've already lost," she said. "That every choice leads to ending, and we're just deciding which ending to die from." Bedivere's face softened with something like grief. "Then why keep fighting?" he asked, and Morgana had no answer that wouldn't sound like madness or despair. The rest of the day passed in terrible isolation. Food came at intervals, brought by servants who wouldn't speak to her. The guard changed at midday, but said nothing beyond confirming she was still inside. From her window she watched Camelot function without her. Knights training, servants working, priests processing to the chapel for afternoon prayer. The world turned regardless of her prophecy, regardless of what she'd shown Arthur, regardless of whether the old religion lived or died. Perhaps that was the cruelest truth, that Britain would continue whether or not anyone remembered the goddess, whether or not the sacred wells flowed, whether or not magic survived. The land didn't need human faith to exist. It was only humans who needed the land to mean something beyond dirt and stone and water. As sunset approached, Morgana made her decision. She had one night left, one final chance to change Arthur's mind before he signed the edict that would close Avalon's mists forever. Glamour had failed by being too beautiful, too perfect, too much like manipulation. Prophecy had failed by showing that both paths led to ruin, leaving Arthur paralyzed between equally terrible choices. But there was one magic she hadn't tried yet, the most dangerous and the most honest: truth-telling. A spell that would strip away every defense and force complete honesty between caster and subject. It was forbidden even in Avalon because it violated the soul's privacy, left both people naked and defenseless. But Morgana had nothing left to lose, no pride or safety or illusion to protect. Tomorrow she would cast it at midnight, and they would finally speak truth to each other, and whatever happened after would at least be real. Chapter 9. The Tower Prison. The guard outside Morgana's door changed again at sunset. Young Sir Gareth, replacing the older Sir Lucan. Youth's idealism, still believing he could protect the kingdom from one unarmed woman. She heard them exchange brief words in the corridor. Has she tried anything? Nothing. Just sits at the window staring at the forest. Poor creature. I remember when she used to visit, before the Queen got so holy. She taught my sister a song once, about birds. That was before she chose darkness over Christ. The conversation ended with footsteps receding, leaving only Gareth and his fidgeting presence between Morgana and whatever slim freedom remained. She would need him gone at midnight, or at least inattentive enough not to notice the spell beginning. Truth-telling required privacy, yet worked best in the vulnerable space between sleeping and waking. When the mind's defenses were already compromised, the room itself had become a kind of prison beyond the locked door and the guard. Morgana had paced every inch of it over these 3 days, memorizing each stone and shadow. And the walls seemed closer now, pressing in like the future she'd shown Arthur. Inevitable, suffocating, inescapable. Her ritual supplies were running low. She'd used the rooster's blood for prophecy, the hawthorn and yew for the scrying circle. For truth-telling, she would need something simpler, but more costly. Her own blood in quantity. And words spoken with such absolute conviction that reality itself would bend to enforce honesty. The spell was ancient, predating even Avalon, whispered about in the oldest texts as something the first priestesses had known but were afraid to teach. Once cast, it couldn't be controlled or contained. Truth would spread like floodwater, drowning everyone it touched in honesty they might not survive. Morgana spent the hours before midnight in preparation, both practical and spiritual. She bathed in the wash basin with water from her drinking pitcher, scrubbing away 3 days of accumulated fear and desperation, making herself clean for magic that would lay her soul bare. She unwound her dark hair from its braids and let it fall loose. A small vanity, or perhaps a small rebellion. This was how her mother had worn her hair, how all the priestesses of Avalon wore theirs during the most sacred rites. She dressed in her simplest shift, removing every piece of jewelry, every decoration, until she was as close to naked as modesty allowed. The truth-telling required nothing between the caster and the spell, no barriers of metal or vanity or protective charms. When midnight came, she would be defenseless, and so would Arthur, and perhaps that shared vulnerability was the only path left to them. The spell itself required only 3 things: blood, intention, and the true name of the person she wished to bind in honesty. She had Arthur's true name. Their mother had whispered it to her once, during her last visit to Camelot before Igraine's death, a secret kept from everyone, including Arthur himself. She would speak that name at midnight, and cut her palm deep enough to bleed in earnest, and the magic would do the rest, reaching across the castle to wrap around Arthur like invisible chains. He would come to her then, drawn by the spell, or perhaps by genuine desire to understand, and neither of them would be able to lie. They would speak the truths that had festered for decades, about Uther and Igraine, about Merlin's manipulation, about power and faith, and the impossible burden of being born to save a dying world. And when the truth was finished with them, they would either understand each other or be destroyed by honesty, too brutal to survive. At 1:45, Morgana heard Gareth shifting outside her door, probably fighting sleep, probably wondering if guarding a locked room was really necessary when the prisoner had shown no sign of violence. She whispered a small spell not forbidden, barely magic at all. Just an encouragement to the sleep he was already courting. His head would nod, his eyes would close, and for the crucial minutes while she cast the truth-telling, he wouldn't notice the power gathering in the tower, like summer lightning before a storm. It was a tiny manipulation compared to the glamour she'd attempted the first night, but it still tasted like defeat. Even trying to enforce honesty required some small dishonesty first, some trick to create the space where truth could breathe. Midnight approached, and Morgana drew her ritual knife across her palm, watching blood well up dark and certain, and began to speak the spell that would strip away every lie between her and her brother, regardless of the cost. Chapter 10. The casting. The words of the truth-telling spell tasted like iron and honey, sweet and sharp and dangerous on Morgana's tongue. She spoke them in the oldest language she knew, the one the Lady of the Lake had taught her in Avalon's depths. Syllables that predated Latin and Saxon both and came from a time when the land itself spoke through human mouths. Each word required blood, so she painted them on her skin as she chanted, on her forehead for clear seeing, on her heart for honest feeling, on her lips so only truth could pass them. The cuts weren't deep, but they were numerous, and soon blood was running down her face and chest, pooling in the hollow of her throat, dripping onto the stone floor where it began to spread in patterns that had nothing to do with gravity and everything to do with magic. The spell built slowly, carefully, like a structure that would collapse if rushed. Morgana had to maintain perfect focus, even as blood loss made her dizzy, even as the magic began to feed on her energy like a hungry child at its mother's breast. She could feel it spreading out from her tower, invisible tendrils reaching through Camelot stones, searching for the person whose true name she'd spoken. It found Arthur in his chambers, wrapped around him like a lover's arms, and she felt his shock and fear and anger as the compulsion took hold. He would fight it at first. His will was strong, trained by years of kingship and war, but the truth-telling was older and more patient than any human resistance. Eventually, he would come to her, drawn by magic and by the soul-deep need to finally speak without pretense or protection. While she waited, the spell began to work on her as well, stripping away the careful lies she'd told herself over decades of exile and loneliness. She'd claimed she wanted to save the old religion, but underneath that noble purpose was rage at Arthur for choosing Guinevere and Christianity over family and heritage. Rage at their mother for dying before making peace. Rage at herself for failing to be whatever a grain had needed her to be. She'd told herself she was fighting for the goddess, but in truth she was fighting against irrelevance, against the terror of being the last priestess of a forgotten faith, against the knowledge that when she died, Avalon might die with her. The truth-telling showed her these ugly realities without mercy or comfort, and Morgana wept even as she laughed at her own self-deception. The door to her chamber opened. She hadn't heard footsteps, hadn't heard the lock turn, but suddenly Arthur was there, still in his sleeping clothes with his hair disarrayed and his eyes wild with the spell's compulsion. "What have you done?" he demanded, but the words came out wrong, twisted by truth-telling into what he really meant. "Why are you making me feel this?" He crossed the room toward her, not threatening but desperate, and Morgana saw that he was bleeding 2 small cuts on his hands and arms, where he'd clawed at himself trying to break the spell's hold. They were matching now, both of them bloodied, both of them stripped of every defense except honesty. The third night had begun, and there was no turning back from whatever truth would emerge. Chapter 11. Night 3. The confrontation. Arthur stood in the center of Morgana's tower room, breathing hard like a man who'd run miles instead of walked down a single corridor. The truth-telling spell wrapped around them both now, thick as fog, impossible to ignore or escape. When he tried to speak a polite greeting, years of courtly training demanding he maintain some dignity, his mouth refused, would only let him say what he actually felt. I hate that you can do this. I hate that you have power I don't understand and can't control. I hate that part of me still loves you, and that love makes me weak. The words seemed to surprise him as much as they hurt Morgana. Brutal in their honesty, proof that the spell was working exactly as intended and exactly as feared. Morgana found herself responding before she could plan the words. Her own defenses stripped away by magic she'd willingly cast. I hate that you abandoned me. When Mother died and you let Guinevere's priests take over. When you stopped visiting Avalon. When you chose their god over our blood dye. Hated you so much I dreamed of your death. She clapped a hand over her mouth, but it was too late. The truth was out, poisoning the air between them. Arthur's face went pale, then flushed with anger, and when he spoke again his voice shook. You think I had a choice? You think I wanted to be king of a Britain that's half Christian and half pagan, trying to please everyone and pleasing no one? I was born from rape, sanctified by your precious magic. How am I supposed to trust anything Merlin taught you? The word rape hung between them like a sword, and Morgana felt something break open in her chest, and grief and a terrible understanding she'd been avoiding for decades. It wasn't rape, she said, and she could feel the spell forcing her to examine that claim, to test it against genuine truth rather than comfortable belief. It was manipulation, violation. Uther wanted Mother and Merlin gave him the spell to take her. And yes, that was evil, that was wrong. But magic didn't rape, our Mother Uther did. A man did. Magic was just the tool, like a sword or a lie. You blame the wrong thing, Arthur. You've spent your whole life hating magic when you should hate the men who misused it. Her voice broke on the last words, tears streaming down her already bloodied face, and she saw Arthur's certainty waver, saw doubt creep into his righteous anger. How am I supposed to know the difference? He asked, and his voice was young suddenly. The boy she'd known before crowns and causes came between them. Every time I see magic, I see control. I see will being overridden, choice being stolen. Your glamour at the feast, you made my nights see things that weren't real, made them question their own perception. Your prophecy, you showed me futures so terrible I can't sleep without seeing them. And now this, whatever this is, dragging me from my bed because you spoke my name in some ritual I don't understand. How is any of that different from what Merlin did to our parents? It was a fair question, Morgana realized with crushing clarity. From his perspective, from outside the practice and understanding of magic, every spell did look like violation, every enchantment like theft of will. She sank to the floor, exhausted from blood loss and honesty, and Arthur sat across from her without being asked, both of them too tired to maintain the pretense of king and subject, reduced to brother and sister, and two people who'd loved each other once. I don't know how to make you trust magic, Morgana admitted. Because you're right, magic can be used to violate and control, the same way a sword can be used to murder. But it can also heal, can also protect, can also help crops grow, and women birth safely, and the dying pass gently. The old religion isn't just spells and power, it's also knowing how to read the land's moods, how to work with seasons instead of against them, how to see the sacred in ordinary things. If you ban it, you don't just ban my power. You ban grandmothers teaching herb lore. You ban farmers blessing their fields. You ban every tiny daily magic that helps people survive. Is that really what you want? The truth-telling forced Arthur to examine the question honestly, to look past the bishop's rhetoric and his own fear and see the real consequences of his edict. His face worked through a dozen emotions: resistance, consideration, grief, and finally something that might have been understanding. "No," he said quietly. "No. I don't want to destroy every scrap of the old ways, but I don't know how to protect the good magic while banning the harmful, how to let you keep your healing herbs while preventing another Merlin from changing someone's face and destroying a family. The bishops say all magic corrupts eventually. That power always seeks more power. How do I know they're wrong?" Morgana had no answer that would satisfy him, no argument that would prove magic could police itself when history showed it often failed to. They sat in silence, bleeding and honest and no closer to a solution. Then Arthur spoke again, and the truth-telling dragged from him an admission Morgana suspected he'd never voiced before. "I'm not just afraid of magic because of Mother. I'm afraid because I can feel it sometimes, in my blood, in my dreams." Merlin's spell didn't just create MIT, left something behind. Some potential for power I don't know how to use or control. What if I'm more like you than I want to admit? What if banning magic is just me trying to ban the part of myself I'm most afraid of? The confession hung in the air between them, heavy with implication. And Morgana saw her brother clearly for perhaps the first time. Not the perfect Christian king, but a frightened man trying to outrun his own nature, trying to be purely human in a world where his very existence was supernatural. Chapter 12. The unintended truth. The truth-telling spell had been spreading while they talked, seeping through Camelot stones like water through cracked earth, and Morgana felt it reach some critical mass around the time Arthur admitted his own potential for magic. Suddenly she could sense people all over the castle beginning to speak truths they'd kept locked away, in the barracks. Knights confessing doubts about Christ's power to protect them in battle. In the kitchens, servants admitting they still left offerings for the house spirits their grandmothers had honored. In the chapel, a young priest weeping as he confessed he'd lost his faith years ago but was too afraid to leave the order. The spell was working exactly as the old texts warned once released. Truth spread like wildfire, consuming everything in its path without discrimination or mercy. Arthur felt it too. She saw recognition dawn in his eyes as the compulsion touched his court. "Make it stop," he said. But the truth-telling forced him to add, "I'm terrified of what they'll say, what secrets will come out, what this will do to my authority." Before Morgana could respond, before she could even try to explain that she couldn't stop it now, that truth-telling ran its course regardless of the caster's willow scream, echoed from somewhere in the castle. Then another. Then voices raised in anger, or anguish, or shocked revelation. a cacophony of honesty that Camelot had never been built to contain. Arthur lurched to his feet, reaching for a sword he wasn't wearing. And Morgana tried to rise, but dizziness from blood loss pulled her back down. The door burst open. The guard must have woken from her sleep. Spellin Bedivere stood there, face stricken with something beyond shock. "My lord," he said, and even from across the room, Morgana could feel the truth-telling working on him, forcing words he'd never meant to speak. "My lord, the court is in chaos. Sir Kay just confessed he's been embezzling from the treasury for years. The head priest admitted he keeps a mistress in the village. And Guinevere," he stopped, visibly fighting the compulsion. But it was stronger than loyalty or love or any human will. "Guinevere and Lancelot are in the chapel. Everyone heard them. Everyone knows." The last words came out broken, and Arthur made a sound like a wounded animal, something between rage and grief and terrible understanding. He turned on Morgana with fury in his eyes, and she saw murder there for a moment, saw how easy it would be for him to draw Bedivere's sword and end the spell by ending the caster. But the truth-telling wouldn't let him act on anger alone. It forced him to acknowledge the deeper feeling underneath. "This is what I feared most. Not that she loved him, I've known that for years, but that everyone would know. That I'd have to act on it, that I'd lose her because my crown demands. I punish adultery even when my heart just wants to pretend it never happened." The confession destroyed him, and Morgana watched her brother collapse under the weight of honest feeling he'd been denying for perhaps a decade. Bedivere caught him, held him up, and the truth-telling made the old knight admit, "I've known too. We've all known. We loved you both too much to force the issue." All over Camelot, the spell was producing similar devastations. Marriages ending as spouses admitted affairs or lost love. Friendships shattering over long-held resentments, finally voiced. The careful social contracts that held the court together dissolving under honesty's acid touch. In the throne room, a delegation of bishops confronted each other with theological doubts and political ambitions, their faith revealed as more complicated than the certainty they'd presented to Arthur. In the servants' quarters, generations of grievances spilled out: who had stolen what, who had betrayed whom, who secretly hated the masters they smiled at each day. Truth was supposed to be noble, liberating, but Morgana was learning that sometimes lies were the mortar that held society's stones together. And without them, everything collapsed into chaos. She tried to draw the spell back in, to contain it before it destroyed more than it revealed. But it was too late. The magic had its own momentum now, would run until dawn, or until it had wrung every secret from every soul in Camelot. Arthur pulled away from Bedivere and stood alone, swaying slightly, his face the color of old parchment. When he spoke, his voice was empty of everything except exhausted truth. "You came here to save your religion, but you've destroyed my kingdom. Every lie that held us together is ashes now. Every secret that let us function is public. How am I supposed to rule people who know I'm a coward about my own wife, who've heard me admit I'm afraid of my own blood?" Morgana wanted to argue, to claim this wasn't what she'd intended. But the truth-telling forced her to acknowledge, "I knew it might spread. I chose to cast it anyway. I was willing to sacrifice your court to save Avalon. And I'm not sorry, even now. The honesty of that admission, the raw selfishness of it seemed to break something in Arthur. He looked at her with eyes that held no love or hate, just a kind of distant recognition, as if seeing her clearly for the first time and realizing she was a stranger. "You're not my sister anymore," he said, and the truth-telling confirmed it. "You're just another person who'll destroy anything to get what you want. Like Merlin, like Uther, like everyone who's ever used power without counting the cost. I don't care about your magic or your goddess or Avalon. I just want you gone before you hurt anyone else I love." He walked out without looking back, Bedivere trailing after him, and Morgana was left alone in her tower with blood drying on her skin and the sounds of a court tearing itself apart echoing through the stones. The third night was done, and she had failed more catastrophically than she'd ever imagined possible. Chapter 13. The Breaking Point. Dawn came gray and cold, the fourth day arriving with the weight of judgment and ending. Morgana hadn't slept, had spent the dark hours listening to Camelot destroy itself confession by confession. The truth-telling finally faded as the sun rose, its compulsion releasing everyone simultaneously, but the damage was permanent. You couldn't unhear a spouse's admission of lovelessness, couldn't unknow a friend's betrayal, couldn't pretend faith you'd heard someone confess they'd lost. The castle felt different now, quieter, more brittle, like a building whose foundations had cracked and was waiting to collapse. She washed the dried blood from her face and hands, dressed in her travel clothes, and prepared to leave before Arthur could make good on his promise to have her arrested or worse. But the king summoned her first, a curt message delivered by a servant who wouldn't meet her eyes. She was to come to the throne room at midday, where Arthur would issue his edict and decide her fate in front of the assembled court. It would be a show trial of sorts. Morgana realized Arthur, reasserting his authority by judging the sorceress who'd humiliated him, proving to his shattered court that he was still strong enough to punish even his own blood. She couldn't blame him for the impulse. In his position, she might do the same. But the thought of standing before those people, the knights who'd confessed cowardice, the ladies who'd admitted affairs, the priests who'd revealed doubt and being condemned for forcing honesty was almost funny in its irony. The throne room was packed but silent when she arrived. Everyone standing in their assigned places but not meeting each other's eyes, united only in their shared humiliation and resentment of the woman who'd caused it. Arthur sat his throne with Guinevere beside him, and the queen looked like she'd been crying for hours, her face pale and swollen, her hands twisted in her lap. Lancelot stood with the other knights, but apart from them, isolated by confession. And Morgana felt a pang of guilt for what she'd done to him. He'd never wanted his love known, had tortured himself trying to be honorable, and she'd stripped away that privacy without permission. The bishops stood in a cluster near the throne, and she could see murder in their eyes. Finally, proof of magic's danger. Finally, permission to demand what they'd wanted all along. Arthur spoke without preamble, his voice carrying across the silent hall. "Morgana of Avalon, sister of my blood and enemy of my peace, you stand accused of using forbidden magic against this court. For 3 nights you have attempted to change my mind about the old religion through enchantment, manipulation, and finally violation of our very souls. You have shown complete disregard for the free will of Christian people, confirming everything the Church has warned about pagan sorcery. I should have you burned for what you've done. The law demands it. Justice demands it." He paused, and Morgana prepared herself for the sentence, for whatever end Arthur had decided she deserved. But then his face shifted, some emotion she couldn't name crossing it like cloud shadow over water. And he continued, "But I will not become Uther, no matter how much you've made me want to." The statement hung in the air, confusing the court, and Arthur stood from his throne, descending the steps to stand level with her king, becoming man again, or trying to. "You asked me for 3 nights to change my mind about banning the old religion. You failed, catastrophically. Your glamour proved magic can deceive. Your prophecy proved both paths lead to ruin, and your truth-telling nearly destroyed my kingdom. Every fear the bishops have about magic, you've confirmed. Every warning they gave me, you've proven true. And yet," he stopped, seeming to struggle with words. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, meant for her alone, though the whole court strained to hear. "And yet in all that disaster, you also showed me something I'd been refusing to see. Magic isn't the problem. People are people like Merlin who use power without conscience, yes, but also people like me who use law without mercy, who try to ban complexity because it's easier than learning to live with it." He turned to address the court. "I came to this week planning to issue an edict banning all practice of the old religion. I believed it was necessary to unite Britain under one faith, to end the confusion and conflict that comes from divided loyalty. But my sister has shown me through methods I can never forgive but must acknowledge that faith cannot be legislated, that belief cannot be controlled through law, and that trying to do so will destroy more than it saves." A murmur ran through the assembled nobles and clergy, and the head bishop started to object, but Arthur cut him off with a gesture. "I will not ban the old religion, but neither will I give it preference or protection. Camelot is and will remain a Christian kingdom, under Christian law, with Christian values guiding Christian rule. Those who wish to practice the old ways may do so in peace, so long as they do not use magic to harm or control others. And those who use magic of any faith to violate free will, as my sister has done, will face the harshest punishment our law allows." Chapter 14. Arthur's Choice. The court erupted in protest from both sides, bishops objecting that tolerance was weakness, that allowing pagan practice would invite God's wrath, while the few remaining practitioners of the old ways argued that permission without protection was just persecution with extra steps. Arthur let them argue for a moment, let the chaos build, then raised his hand for silence with an authority Morgana had never seen in him before. This was kingship without the pretense she'd always assumed was part of Itra will, backed by genuine power. The ability to hold a room through nothing but presence and certainty. "I have made my decision," he said, and his voice carried the weight of finality. "Debate it if you must, but it will not change. Britain needs peace more than it needs purity. and I will enforce tolerance even if both sides hate me for it." The head bishop stepped forward, his face red with righteous anger. "My lord, you cannot allow witchcraft to flourish in a Christian kingdom. The Bible is clear: suffer not a witch to live. To permit their rituals is to invite demons into the very heart of—" But Arthur cut him off with a look that would have stopped a charging boar. "The Bible also tells me to love my enemies and pray for those who persecute me. I notice you bishops are selective about which commands you insist I follow. The Church will have my protection and my patronage, but it will not have my sword to enforce its theology. If your God is as powerful as you claim, he doesn't need my help killing old women who make healing charms." The bishop opened his mouth to argue further, but Arthur's hand dropped to his sword hilt. Not a threat exactly, but a reminder of where ultimate authority rested. Then Arthur turned to Morgana, and his face held something more complicated than anger or forgiveness, maybe just exhausted recognition that they were both trapped by roles larger than themselves. "You will leave Camelot today and not return while I live. You will take word back to Avalon that the mists will remain open, that your priestesses can continue their work, but that any use of magic to control or harm my subjects will be treated as treason. I'm giving you what you came for, the survival of the old religion, but I'm also giving you exile, because I can't trust you near my court or my family." He paused, and something that might have been grief crossed his face. "I loved you once, sister, maybe I still do, but love isn't enough when trust is gone, and what you did last night killed whatever trust remained between us." Morgana wanted to argue, to point out that she'd only used truth-telling because he'd forced her into desperate measures. That 3 nights wasn't enough to undo decades of misunderstanding. That exile was just a slower form of the death he'd promised earlier. But she was too tired, and somewhere in the wreckage of these 3 days, she'd lost the certainty that she was entirely right and he was entirely wrong. Magic had violated Camelot's people even if she'd meant it as liberation. Truth had destroyed as much as it revealed, and Arthur was offering survival for Avalon even if it came wrapped in conditions that would slowly starve the old ways of new believers. It wasn't victory, but it wasn't complete defeat. Either it was the messy compromise of people who both wanted to be right, but had to settle for both being partially wrong. "I accept your terms," she said formally, and felt the weight of the throne room's attention pressing down like physical force. "The old religion will survive in the margins you've allowed, and I'll return to Avalon with news that the mists will remain open. But know this, brother, your tolerance is cold comfort to people who've been told their faith is barely permitted, that their sacred practices are one mistake away from being called treason. You're offering survival, not welcome, existence, not equality. And while I'm grateful for even that much, it's not the Britain I hoped to build." Arthur's face hardened at her words, but he didn't argue, and Morgana realized they'd both said everything there was to say. The conversation, 3 nights of magic and disaster, was finally over. The court began to disperse, everyone eager to escape the tension, to return to chambers where they could begin the work of forgetting, or at least pretending last night's confessions had never happened. But Guinevere rose from her throne and crossed to Morgana, moving with the careful dignity of someone held together by pure will. The queen took her hands, a shocking intimacy in front of the assembled courtiers, spoke quietly enough that only Morgana could hear. "Thank you. I know that's not what you want to hear, that you think you failed, but you gave me something I didn't know I needed. Last night, when the truth came out about Lancelot, I thought my life was over. But Arthur found me afterward, and we really talked. For the first time in years, and he told me he'd known and chosen to love me anyway. Your truth-telling didn't destroy my marriage. It saved it by making us stop lying." Tears ran down the queen's face. But she was smiling, and Morgana felt something loosen in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but the knowledge that the spell hadn't been entirely disaster, that sometimes truth hurt on the way to healing. The forest at Camelot's borders had been cut back even further than she remembered. Farmers claiming land for crops and pasture, the wild places shrinking with each passing season. But in the remaining trees she saw offerings tied to branches, bits of ribbon, carved figures, stones painted with protective symbols. The old ways survived in these small gestures, would continue surviving in grandmothers teaching children to read weather signs, in midwives blessing newborns with herbs and whispered charms, in farmers leaving cream for the house spirits their Christian lords pretended not to believe in. At the forest's edge, she turned for one last look at Camelot's towers rising against the morning sky. Crosses crowned them all now. But if she squinted, she could imagine them as they'd been in her childhood. Banners of every color. The sound of her mother's laughter in the gardens. Arthur running to meet her with some new treasure he'd found, a bird's feather, a perfect stone, a story he'd heard from the stablemen. They'd been happy once, before crowns and causes had come between them, before religion had become a war instead of a choice. She wondered if he was watching from some window, if he felt the same grief at this ending, if he understood that they'd both lost something irreplaceable in these 3 nights of magic and truth. The ride to Avalon took 3 days, plenty of time to think about everything she'd done and failed to do. Every choice that had led to exile and compromise instead of triumph. The Lady of the Lake met her at the shore, rising from water that reflected nothing but sky, and Morgana delivered Arthur's message. The mists would stay open. The old religion could survive, but Camelot was closed to her forever, and any priestess who used magic harmfully would be treated as a criminal. The lady listened without expression, those ancient eyes seeing more than Morgana could hide, then simply nodded. "You fought for us," she said quietly. "You failed and you succeeded, and you learned that sometimes there's no difference between the two. That's more than most manage in a lifetime." She sank back into the water without another word, leaving Morgana standing at the boundary between worlds, with no idea whether she'd saved anything or just delayed inevitable defeat. Back in Avalon, surrounded by priestesses who'd trusted her to save their faith, Morgana told them about Arthur's edict, about the cold tolerance he'd offered instead of the warm acceptance she'd hoped for. Some wept, others raged, a few nodded as if they'd expected no better. In the days that followed, She wrote down everything that had happened in those 3 nights, the glamour, the prophecy, the truth-telling, and all the unintended consequences that had flowed from desperate magic. She wrote it as a warning for future priestesses, that magic cannot force change in hearts that aren't ready, that truth without compassion is just another form of violence, that sometimes the cost of fighting for what you believe in is higher than you ever imagined paying. She titled it 3 Nights in Camelot and locked it in the temple's deepest vault, where perhaps someday someone would read it and learn from her mistakes. Years passed. Arthur sent no word, and she sent none back, both of them honoring the exile he decreed. But travelers brought news from time to time. The king had indeed maintained his promise, neither banning the old ways nor favoring them, walking a careful line between Christian law and pagan tolerance. The church complained, but Arthur held firm. Occasional priestesses were arrested for using magic to harm, but farmers who blessed their fields were left alone. It wasn't the Britain Morgana had dreamed of, faith coexisting in mutual respect, but it also wasn't the nightmare of total persecution she'd feared. It was something messier and more human, compromise, uncomfortable and incomplete, but allowing both traditions to survive. On the 10th anniversary of those 3 nights, Morgana received an unexpected visitor, a young priestess from a village near Camelot, barely 16, nervous and awed to be in Avalon's presence. She carried a message from her grandmother, an old woman who'd been a servant in the castle and witnessed everything. The message was simple: tell the Lady Morgana that what she did mattered. Tell her that the court healed from that night of truth, slowly and painfully, but they healed. Tell her that the king speaks of her sometimes, when he's old and tired, and he always says the same thing. She was right about some things. I was right about others. We were both too proud to find the middle ground. Tell her that's not forgiveness, but it's not hatred either, and maybe that's enough. Morgana sent the girl back with gifts for her grandmother, and thanks for the message, then walked to Avalon's highest point, where she could almost see Camelot's towers in the distance, and wept for what she and Arthur had both lost, and both somehow managed to save.